Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Magruder, Vice President for Public Programs here at the National Geographic Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Grosvenor Auditorium for this special event that we are just wonderfully glad to be able to host for the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. Before we get started, I want to remind you to turn off your cell phones if you got one. In fact, I need to turn mine off. All right, done. Turn off your cell phones, and also please refrain from using any flash devices on your cameras as well. I also want to remind you to just take notice of all the exits in the room. We have two here. In the unlikely case of an emergency, our ushers and our staff will tell you what you need to do. But I want to say that we do a number of programs here at the National Geographic Society on this stage, from concerts, film programs, to lectures with some of our top photographers. But I think this program is wonderfully special. It's in conjunction with the exhibition at Smithsonian Natural History, Race, Are We So Different? You can see the logo there on the stage. And here at the National Geographic, we've had conversations about this topic. In the last year, we presented the exhibition America I Am, the African American imprint, and also with our project, the Genographic Project. Let's see a show of hands. How many of you are familiar with this project? And this is kind of what it is about. It is a program that involves citizens. In this box, there's a swab. You swab your cheek and you send it in. And what this program does is trace the journey of your ancestors out of Africa. And over the course of 5 years, hundreds of thousands of people from around the world have participated in this. And this project, like America I Am and the conversation that you're going to be able to listen to today, address that question that all of us have: where are we from and who are we? So to continue this program, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the stage Jessica Martinez. Jessica is the person who created this program. Jessica is the educator for scholarship programs at the National Geographic, no, not at our place. I can't have you. I'm sorry, at Smithsonian Museum of African Art. So I'm doing a Rick Perry here, aren't I? Huh? So please join me in giving Jessica a warm National Geographic welcome. Jessica.
Now I feel like I'm home. Thank you. Thank you to Greg Magruder and his team at National Geographic Live, Ed Sapp, Bob Attardi, Rita Dooley, and others. It's been a true pleasure to work with all of you. And special thanks also to the Smithsonian AV team, Mike Briggs and Mark Bretzfelder. This program is being webcast live on africa.si.edu and will appear on the Smithsonian's Ustream TV channel in the coming days. So I want to welcome you all to this director's discussion with acclaimed philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah. This is the first in a series of conversations between Smithsonian National Museum of African Art Director Johnnetta Betsch Cole and leading public intellectuals, artists, and other cultural producers. Dr. Cole will next sit with noted chef Marcus Samuelsson in early February, so do look for that. But today, what a fitting way to start with one of the world's foremost thinkers. Two occasions have really called us together here today. First, the exhibition Race, Are We So Different?, now on view at the National Museum of Natural History. And second, the annual meeting of the African Studies Association, when thousands of Africanist scholars descend on DC to share their new research and also chart the future of their fields. Dr. Kwame Anthony Appiah has critically engaged with theories of race and identity and has published widely on African intellectual history and ethics. His current work deals with the connection of theory and practice in moral life. After being awarded his doctorate in philosophy at Cambridge University, he went on to teach at Yale, Cornell, Duke, and Harvard universities. He's now a member of the Princeton University faculty, where he has dual appointments in the philosophy department and the University Center for Human Values. He's written a number of seminal books, among them In My Father's House, 1992, Color Conscious, The Political Morality of Race, 1996, The Ethics of Identity in 2005, Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers from 2006, and most recently, The Honor Code, How Moral Revolutions Happen, that came out this past October. He's also the author of 3 novels and reviews regularly for the New York Review of Books. And I must share this, that in 2009, Forbes magazine named Professor Appiah one of the world's 7 most powerful thinkers. His honorary degrees and awards are just too numerous to list, but do include election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Until 2009, he served as a trustee of Ashesi University College in Accra, Ghana, and is currently member of the advisory board of the United Nations Democracy Fund. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you and warmly welcome our distinguished guest, Kwame Anthony Appiah.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. I always say that my mother was British and my father was Ghanaian, and when people give you a nice introduction like that, my British side comes out and I get embarrassed. But then I remember that I'm also half Ghanaian and I just accept it. I say, it's nice, it's good for people to say nice things about you, so thank you very much. I'm just going to talk briefly for maybe 20 minutes, and then you'll have the privilege of seeing me interrogated by Johnnetta Cole. So what I wanted to talk about to sort of frame our conversation was about race, about museums, and about art. And one of the things I like to do in thinking about these things is to draw to people's attention the fact that the way we think about these things is the result of a history. There's no natural way to think about human classification. There isn't a single best way. There isn't a way that God fixed. There isn't a natural way to make museums work. Museums are a historical institution. They're different in many different places. They've developed over time. And finally, the concept of art, our modern conception of art, our idea that it's natural to classify certain things together as art. That idea, too, has a history and is contestable. And indeed, a large part of the work of contemporary artists is to challenge our preconceptions about art. That's one of the things that artists do. They broaden our sense of what can count as art, and they've been doing that consistently ever since the idea that there were arts in this modern sense was developed. Now, I'm not an intellectual historian, and whenever anyone who isn't an intellectual historian says when something began, some historian raises his hand and says, no, it began earlier. I'm going to talk about the origins of these ideas in the Enlightenment, which has the advantage that here in the United States that we can think of our country as having been invented in the Enlightenment as well. So there's a reason why Americans should be particularly interested in this process. But of course, many of the ways of putting these things together that I'm going to talk about have earlier histories, and I don't wish to deny that. But still, there's a particular way in which these things come together, I think, in the 18th century, in the North Atlantic world, in the world of discourse that includes North American intellectuals, British, German, French, Italian, Spanish, European intellectuals, Scandinavian intellectuals, in that period of great intellectual ferment. That's the period, among other things, in which the great encyclopedic museums are invented, in which the British Museum comes into being. And the idea that shaped the British Museum is an idea that is there also in say, the museums of the Museumsinsel in Berlin. It's there in other places in the world, this idea of, and it's there in our country, though, of course, it wasn't constructed in the 18th century. It's there in our country in a place like the Smithsonian Institution, which is a great encyclopedic museum. It's a museum of everything, right? There's nothing about which you can say, oh, we can't have a show about that in the Smithsonian because the Smithsonian doesn't cover that. Anything that you could think about, the Smithsonian somewhere has a home for. And the idea that you should have an institution where people could create displays about anything, that's a very strange idea. It's a very powerful idea. It took off very, very nicely. Once the idea came along, people thought this was a good idea. Among the people, by the way, who thought it was a good idea was was one of the early 19th century Asante kings, who was told about the British Museum by a visiting missionary, and who created the first museum in my hometown in Ghana, in Kumasi, in the early 19th century. Unfortunately, it was ransacked by the British later, and so we don't have it anymore. But so this idea of the Encyclopedic Museum is one that may have started in a particular part of the world at a particular time, but it's gone everywhere, and it's a powerful idea. Now, one of the things that's going on at the same time as the development of this idea of museums, in this modern sense, is a set of new ideas about race and a set of new ideas about nationality, about peoplehood, about what brings people together naturally to make a nation. As you know, here in the United States in the late 18th century, ideas about what it was to be an American nation were being constructed. But the same things were going on in Western Europe. As you also know, I'm sure, the modern states like Germany and Italy that we think of as part of the natural configuration of Europe didn't exist in the 18th century. It's not just that Germany was divided in two parts after the Second World War. It was only brought together a couple of generations before that, for the first time in the modern world, into one political unit. And the same is true of Italy. Italy is a product of bringing together many, many different bits in the 19th century, in the name of ideas. And these ideas are too complicated and too manifold for me to even adumbrate all of them. But one that I think is particularly relevant to our purposes is this. It's that nations are brought together by something called a national spirit. The German word is Geist, which shares its etymology with the English word ghost, as in Holy Ghost, that is, as in spirit. Now, the idea that groups of people have a shared spirit is actually, again, it's an idea that develops at a particular time. It's a completely unobvious idea, I think. I mean, it's not obvious that all the Italians have a common spirit, or that all the Germans do, or that all the British do, that all the Asante have a common spirit. Actually, in Asante, it's a natural idea because the idea of a shared spirit is part of Asante thinking about identity too. But this way of thinking gets put together. And one of the things that characterizes the national spirit, not surprisingly, is that it shows itself in the things the people of the nation have in common. What do they have in common? Well, language. So the national spirit is to be heard in the language. In fact, in German, there's a word, Sprachgeist, which means the spirit of the language, and is sort of identified with the spirit of the German people defined as the German-speaking people. But more generally, cultural life, not just language, but what we do with language, poetry, song, the novel, folk song, all of these are expressions of a shared national spirit. And that's a very powerful idea. It's the idea that gives rise to something that is well represented in the Smithsonian museums. It gives rise to the idea of folklore, knowledge about the folk. What is knowledge about the folk? It's knowledge about what the folk's spirit produces. And so the folklore, which is a word that's invented in English in the mid-19th century, goes with words that are invented in French and German and Italian at the same time to talk about the spirit of the nation that's bringing it together. Now, so we've got the museum, we've got the nation coming to be conceived of as this thing with a shared spirit, and then into this equation, increasingly through the 19th century, we have the idea of a race, and the race too comes to be conceived by certain people as having a spirit. You want to have evidence for that? Well, what's the most famous book about African American life? It's W.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. It's about the Geist of African Americans. And this is not contingent because W.B. Du Bois, of course, was a graduate student at the University of Berlin, where people were developing these ideas, where people developing this idea that the nation is bound together by its spirit. And that's why Du Bois thought of black people as like a nation. He thought of them as like a nation in the respect that they had a common spirit. And that meant, see, that's different from the way of thinking of nations that some of you may have, because you may think of nations as the product of political histories and states and so on. But you have to remember that when these ideas were being put together, Germany wasn't a country. So you couldn't explain what made the Germans German by talking about their having a shared set of institutions. They didn't have a set of shared institutions. Some of them were living in free cities. Some of them were they were ruled by bishops. Some of them were ruled by princes. There was a king in Prussia. There were all kinds of different rulerships. So many of them, the German-speaking peoples, were living within the Holy Roman Empire under the rule of a German-speaking, a German ancestored person who probably mostly spoke French, actually, at the Viennese court. So they couldn't have given that account of what brought the nation together. So they gave this other account. They gave this account of it as a spiritual thing, as a geistige thing, as a thing that had to do with the life of the mind and the spirit and the soul. And if you want to see the signs of this in Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, it's absolutely there. Every one of the essays in the Souls of Black Folk begins with what? It begins with a little piece of what Du Bois called the sorrow songs, that is what we would now call Negro spirituals. Well, perhaps we wouldn't call them Negro spirituals anymore, but African-American spirituals. Those little pieces of song are there because in this way of thinking, the songs of the folk are an expression of the spirit of the folk, right? That's why the German folklorists collected German folklore. It wasn't because they were terribly interested in ordinary people. It was because they thought that in listening to the folk songs of ordinary people, they were hearing the German spirit. That's why you've heard of them, the Brothers Grimm. You remember the Grimm's fairy tales? Why did they collect those tales from an ordinary peasant woman? Because they were an expression of the German spirit. The Brothers Grimm, who collected those folk tales, also made the first German dictionary. And those were both two ways into the German language and two ways, therefore, into the German spirit. They thought that when they collected a folk tale about Cinderella in a German village, what they were capturing was a snapshot of the German spirit in exactly the same sort of way in which when you read a poem by Heine, the high art of the nation, you are capturing an aspect of the German spirit. Okay, so this way of thinking is applied to races as well as to nations, and indeed the distinction between races and nations is not a very clear one in the thinking of people in the early 19th century. So you've got museums coming together, you've got folklore being collected. Where does the folklore go? Well, it goes into the ethnographic museums. It goes into museums which exhibit the life of the Völker, of all the folks, of all the peoples of the world. And each folk is distinct. In the original conception of this by Johann Gottlieb Herder, who's the great sort of theorist of these things in Germany, the folks are equal. They're different, they're separate but equal, and each has a voice. And in fact, he's a great cosmopolitan, and his thought is they each have a voice, and so what they produce together is the chorus of humanity. But for that chorus to work, everybody has to have a different voice. Everybody has to speak with her own voice, sing with her own voice. And the result is that you get a conception of the world as divided into beautiful but separate spiritual boxes, each of which has its own spirit, each of which is expressing its own spirit in its folk song, in its poetry, in its literature, and then in its music, its painting, its sculpture, its arts. So the idea of the arts develops. The idea that it's a sort of strange idea, right? That painting and poetry and music and printmaking are all, in some sense, the same thing. They're all art. That's a strange idea. It's a modern idea. Well, that idea that all of these are the same thing grows with the idea that art expresses both the genius, the spirit, the geist of a folk, and, of course, the genius of individual creative artists. And the same word is used for both. It's Goethe's genius and the German genius are both expressed in Goethe's poetry. Mozart's genius and the genius of German music is expressed in Zauberflöte, and so on. All right, all these things are coming together with the production of museums. So it's natural that museums are a center for the articulation both of the idea that peoples have these deep natures, which are expressive of the fact that they have a shared spirit, and also, of course, of the idea that they're separate and different from one another, and in particular, therefore, that it's important for you, individually, to identify the right spirit for you to express. You have to be properly a German or properly an American, and this is a way of thinking that has the darkest side of it is that it's terribly hostile to hybridity. It's terribly hostile to the idea, because if my English mother and my Asante father come together, they bring spirits that should be kept apart together. And I am a mutt, a mongrel, a hybrid, and hybridity, from this point of view, looks dangerous. So there's a dark side to this picture, and having sort of articulated this picture before you explained it, I want to say, look, don't you feel this picture? Maybe you don't believe in it, maybe you don't agree with it, but don't you feel that if you look around us in the history of the way in which we've thought about things, in the way in which we've put our institutions together, there are traces of these ideas. So, let's... how many of you actually been to the race show at the Smithsonian? Good, a lot of you. Okay, so that show argues, it's a powerfully argumentative show, as are many things in the Natural History Museum. I was walking through it this morning thinking, I wonder what it feels to walk through this museum if you're a creationist. Because it's organized around the idea of evolution, right? I mean, you just, and in fact, if the word evolution didn't occur, it does, if it didn't occur, what you would think, looking at all those, I took a picture of my partner Henry in front of a thing that said man and related primates, but the thing is, looking at those skeletons, it does occur to you that we're related, just, without any argument. You just look at it and think, wow, take the flesh off, and gorillas and chimps and humans look awfully like each other. Anyway, there's an argument in this show, and the argument has very much to do with the consensus among anthropologists that one of the attempts to take this idea of the race that I was talking about in the later 19th century, one of the attempts to take that idea and make a science around it, one of the attempts to understand what race was through connecting it with biology, is a big mistake. It doesn't help. You don't get to understand our human biological variation. You don't get to understand what makes brothers like their sisters, but also like their remote cousins. You don't get to understand any of that by trying to treat the world as divided into a small set of distinct biologically defined groups. Well, I want to say that idea that we've got to separate us out into these separately defined groups, that idea is the same idea as the idea that led to the idea that you had to be separated out into separately defined nations. It's just at a different level of generality. And what happened in the late 19th century, after Darwin and the origin of species, after Mendel was rediscovered in the early 20th century and the idea of modern genetics develops, was that people tried to give an account of these groups in terms of this new science. We're always trying to fit old ideas, explain old problems in terms of the new science. And the argument of this show is it doesn't work. It produces bad science or no science at all. I'm the wrong person to disagree with that. I think that that's correct. But I want you to know that there are people who disagree with that, and that and therefore the argument is, as it were, one side of an argument, and that it's an argument that's still, I think, live, not just in our society, but in many societies around the world, and therefore it's an argument worth making. And I was glad to see it being made. But if you accept that argument, if you accept the argument that that way of dividing the world up into nations or races is biologically unsound, then you have to ask yourself a question. The old story of African art, the 19th century story of African art, was that it was an expression of the Negro genius, that it was an expression of the African spirit. If you think that there isn't a national spirit in Africa, and you think that in part because there isn't an African race to have a spirit, there are lots of different kinds of Africans, then you have to tell a different story about why you should collect in one building stuff that happens to have in common the fact that it was mostly made by people out of Africa. Now, if you think of the National Museum for African Art in the old way, you will think that because you will say it should be sub-Saharan Africa. You will say that because sub-Saharan Africa is the home of the Negro race, whose genius is being expressed in Negro art, and therefore it's perfectly appropriate not to have anything from North Africa, because after all, the North African stuff is mostly made by Berbers and Arabs who come from another racial group. A group we should respect, as we should respect the Negro race, as we should respect the Caucasian race, but still a distinct group. And so you will think it perfectly natural that museums for African art are essentially historically museums of Negro art, that is, museums of art produced by black people. And you will think that that's natural because you will think that black people are a group defined by God or nature, and that they have a common, there's some spirit that they have in common. And therefore, when you walk through a show at the National Museum for African Art or in the African collection of the Metropolitan Museum, this picture will speak to you, and you will find yourself saying, you know, this is really like that. You'll find yourself looking at a Dan mask, and then going down to a mask from, say, Angola or Congo, and you'll think, this is all African stuff, and so it speaks to me through one voice, and so you will find yourself expecting resonances. Right. Well, maybe there are resonances, and maybe there are historical explanations why there should be such resonances, but you can't base your theory of resonances anymore on the idea that African art is the art of the Negro people, and the Negro people have a spirit that is expressed in their art, because that theory is every which way wrong. So, you can reasonably ask yourself, how should we understand the categories, the racial categories that we use in our lives today? There's no doubt that we use racial categories. There's no doubt that there's something crazy about a person who says that Jesse Jackson isn't an African American on the grounds that they don't believe in race, or that someone says that Bill Clinton isn't a Caucasian because they don't believe in the white race. There's something crazy about that. You're missing something about American social reality if you don't know those things. But we have to give a different account. We can't give, according to the Smithsonian and the American Anthropological Association, and by the way, we can't give that account, so we have to give a different account. And then we have to have a story about why, given our new account, it makes sense to have a National Museum for African Art. And the director of the National Museum for African Art is now going to quiz me about whether I have such an account.
Join me in inviting to the stage Dr. Johnnetta Betsch Cole, Director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. This museum is the world's leading center of scholarly and artistic excellence on the arts of Africa. Its unparalleled collections, exhibitions, programs, publications, and educational initiatives are widely accessible and strengthened through collaborations with African, diasporic, and global arts communities. We seek in all that we do to inspire conversations about the beauty, power, and diversity of African arts and cultures worldwide. And so in that spirit, Drs. Cole and Appiah will take center stage now for their conversation, after which there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. As I came to join Professor Appiah, I whispered to him that there's something of the Anasi in him, the trickster, the way he set this up. But I first want to say with great sincerity, this is an honor for our museum to launch this series of discussions with you. And so we do thank you. And I also want to thank my colleague, Jessica Levin-Martinez. The very notion that I would have this joy of discussing with some of our world's truly great thinkers and artists and scholars, this came directly out of the head of Jessica Levin-Martinez. When Jessica proposed that we might launch this series by taking on, within the same frame of discussion, race, and I just always do that, race, museums, art, it was pretty clear that you were going to have to come to do this because indeed, much of your work seems to find it quite intriguing to put these huge ideas together. I want to ask you something that could be provocative from the very beginning, and that is that at the Smithsonian we already have something called the Museum of African Art. We have the Museum of the American Indian. There is the Latino Center, and I think my colleague Eduardo Diaz is with us. But there is now a great deal of discussion about the possibility of a museum of the Latino American people. The Freire Sackler focuses on Asian art. If we move beyond the Smithsonian, in the city or the District of Columbia, there's a Holocaust Museum. There's a Museum of Women in the Arts. And of course, to appear in 2013 in the form of a building with stunning collections will be the Museum of African American History and Culture. How do you respond, Professor Appiah, to these ideas of using race or ethnicity or gender as the center of a museum?
Well, I mentioned the invention of the great encyclopedic museum as a museum in which it would sort of do anything. Mm-hmm. But we've always had, as well, museums that were about the identity of a particular place. There's the Museum of the Tower of London. Mm-hmm. We've had museums that focus on movements in art or on religious traditions. I mean, we've had museums of many, many kinds. So the idea that a museum could also be organized around an identity strikes me as a perfectly natural one in a world like ours in which social identities are so central to our experience of ourselves, to our experience of the world, and to our interactions with one another. The standard objection, of course, is that in drawing attention to one identity, among others, we sharpen the boundaries between men and women, or between black and white people, or between Asians and non-Asians, or between Latinos and Anglos, and so on, and then you get the sort of why can't we all be one? Why can't we all rush back?
Why can't we all get together?
Why can't we all get together? Why can't we all get along, as he said after the riots in LA. Well, I think the answer to that is, first, that actually one of the ways in which boundaries get kept sharp is by not attending to the salience of identities. One of the reasons why why it's hard in Ireland in the north today why there's a relatively sharp Protestant Catholic boundary is because there isn't actually a good public discourse in Northern Ireland about Catholic identity and Protestant identity. I think that, given that these identities are out there in the world, reflection upon them is necessary in order to get along. So that I don't share the view that drawing attention to identities is necessarily divisive. I think the divisions are there, and thinking about identity, whether it's through thinking about it in relation to the arts in particular, or more generally in terms of sort of social and cultural life, history, is a useful thing to do in order to build those links. So when someone says about a national group, well, we got to understand we've got to have museums about German culture. I want to say two things. Yes, I think it is good to have museums about German culture, but those museums don't have to. Those museums have to be put together by curators who know things. And one of the things that any curator who knows anything about German culture will know is what Herder, whom I mentioned, said when he was asked to list the greatest German writers, and he mentioned among them a man called William Shakespeare. And what he meant was, William Shakespeare was as important for German intellectual and literary life as he thought, almost, Goethe. And the standard translations of Shakespeare were important to them. German music, that music wouldn't be interesting if all the composers in Germany had said, whoops, Italian, I must shut my ears. Or, whoops, Arab, I must shut my ears. The sounds you hear in what we call classical music, or in romantic music, which we also call classical music rather confusingly, the sounds we hear are shaped by histories of exchange across these boundaries. How could you, for example, construct a museum of African American history which said nothing about white people?
Impossible.
I don't know what that would look like. African American is an American category. It was made by Americans. It was made in America. It was made by all Americans. So was American Indian as a category made by all Americans. It wasn't made just by people looking at American Indians. American Indian, there are American Indian organizations now, and they are, and so the American Indian identities, both at the generic level and at the specific level of Cherokee, Sioux, Lakota, those levels of identity, are the product of dialogue between insiders and outsiders. They always are. And so whenever you look at it, again, what would a museum of women or gender look like in which there was nothing about men? So I think focusing on an identity doesn't mean ignoring the fact that that identity is itself shaped in dialogue with other identities, and that in focusing for the moment on this one, we are, among other things, preparing ourselves for other moments when this identity will fade into the background and we'll be thinking about something else. The fact that you think that the National Museum of African American History is important doesn't entail that you don't think that it's important that there's a history museum, American History Museum on the same mall. It doesn't mean that you think that that we should close down anything else.
I'm thinking of Shiro, Audre Lorde, excuse me, who cautioned us about singular identities. I knew her at Hunter College, and in a very dramatic way, she would often introduce herself. She'd say, I'm Audre Lorde, a black woman, lesbian, feminist, mother, professor, warrior poet.
Yes.
And she would go on to say, how dare you deny me any of these multiple identities? How do we ever get to a point where, in fact, each of us can move with much greater grace and joy in our multiple identities?
Right. So I think that, look, a lot of bad stuff has been done in the name of, say, racial identities in the world, and it was a natural thought. Okay, let's just abandon this category, right? Terrible things have been done in this name, so let's abandon it. That's one strategy. And maybe in the very long run that'll work. But I don't. But in the present, where these identities are doing their work for good as well as for ill, acknowledging them, thinking about them, working on them, and allowing ourselves, as you said, as Audre Lorde says, to see ourselves as at the intersection. Everybody is at the intersection of lots of identities. We don't actually. In contemporary America, we tend not to name our family identities, right? The Smiths, the Coles, and so on. But in fact, you know, the sense of yourself as belonging to a continuing group of people who have shared ancestry at the lowest level, at the level of grandfathers and grandmothers and great-grandfathers. That sense of yourself is very powerful for even for supposedly rootless contemporary Americans, and certainly, of course, has been very, very powerful throughout human history in many places. So, but notice that can be very, very important to me, my sense of myself as belonging to my father's matriclan, say, while it's also being true that everybody who exists is the product of at least two of these things, right? You have to get people from different matriclans together to make new people. Because sex within the matriclan is incestuous, so you can't do that. So similarly, every person is the product of a coming together of families. And many, many Americans are the coming together not just of families, but of religious traditions. We have, Bob Putnam at Harvard has pointed this out recently in a wonderful book called American Grace, that what's interesting about the American religious situation today is not so much the fact that we have a great diversity of religions, it's that we have religiously diverse families. 50 years ago, typically, if you were a Catholic, all your uncles and aunts were Catholic. Yeah, it's not true anymore. That's one big change. More and more people have a Jewish. They're Catholic, but they have a Jewish cousin or a Jewish aunt or uncle. More and more people also change confessional identities in the course of their lives. And again, that was very rare in the past. People become Jewish, and people become Baptist, and or cease to be Baptist and become Methodist. Horror of horrors, and so on. So I think these. In other words, each of us now is not just living with multiple identities, but we're often living in small groups which are diverse in new ways. One of the great changes in the last 30, 40 years in this country has been that more and more people live in groups that are small groups that are explicitly of different sexualities. That they're not. You don't think that everybody you know is. If you're straight, you don't think that everybody you know is straight. If you're gay, you don't think that everybody you know is gay. And so you have not only your Jewish aunt, if you're a Catholic, but you have your gay uncle, as it were. And again, that kind of diversity is in our intimate lives, it's in our family lives, it's around the Thanksgiving table, as well as in our political lives and in the Congress and so on. So, you know, you could imagine a kind of picture of human life before modernity, in which people lived in small communities, villages, we might call them, and had simple identities because they only had a family identity and a gender. Everybody had the same religion and so on. But even in those worlds, right, you had clans and forms of identity within the village, and every family was the result of an interaction between clans. So now it's gotten harder. There's no doubt it's gotten harder because, or I would say more interesting. It's gotten more interesting because now the list of identities that's sort of out there and in play is bigger than it was. I haven't yet mentioned the fact that we have vast arrays of professional identities. I don't just mean that there are different jobs. I mean that people think of themselves as, for example, scientists, and often have a dim view of people who aren't scientists, artists, novelists, doctors, lawyers. These are things that are deep in people in the sort of way in which being Jewish or Catholic is deep in a person. And there's lots of them. So I think, and yet, what strikes me about all this, and I wrote about this in my father's house in relation to my father, what strikes me about all this is that people know perfectly well, if you don't bash them over the head with theory, people know perfectly well in practice how to do that. My father knew when he was needing to think about himself as an Asante, when he needed to think of himself as a Ghanaian, when he needed to think of himself as an African, when he needed to think of himself as a Methodist, when he needed to think of himself as a man. And he was all of those things deeply and profoundly and committedly, and it wasn't a problem. Very, very rarely did they pull in different directions, and when they did, he knew which side he was on.
When did your dad wear kente cloth?
Well, so
what circumstances would make him?
Any celebratory circumstances? I wasn't. So I don't know how much people know about kente cloth, but in Asante, the form that we're talking about of kente cloth was invented in Asante in a village called Bonwiri in the 19th century. It's made originally out of silk, which of course came from other parts of the world. So it's an Asante thing that needed silk from Asia to make it, and also the dyes came from elsewhere, some of them. And the most spectacular forms, predictably, were reserved for the members of the royal Oyoko clan. But other people were allowed to wear fancy ones too, and they developed with names and associations with various kinds of groups. And the names are proverbial often, and so people who know about them know when they see a cloth, they know some words come to mind and some thoughts come to mind. So on. All right, and they're the clothes to wear on the most important fancy occasion. So my father, of course, wore a kente at his own wedding, but also at any other weddings that he went to. Unless he wore white cloth, which is another thing you can wear at a wedding in celebration. He would have worn them to on any occasion where he was representing Ghana, when he was an ambassador. He would, unless it was too cold, in which case he would have worn his savile row suit. And when I was growing up, I had to reach a certain age before I was allowed to wear first cloth at all. Children don't wear it, and then little boys don't wear it, and then he gave me my first kente, which is one of his kentes, when I was sort of 14, 15, and it's still sitting there it's in the drawer by the bed in my home in New Jersey, and I don't have much occasion to wear it, but if you ask me to a sufficiently ceremonial occasion, I might. And I want to say something about, I think, so for my father, he was a lawyer as well as a Methodist, and he was a member of Parliament, and at various points an ambassador. And for him, it was really important that as often as possible in his official duties, he didn't wear suits. He wore ntama cloth, worn like a toga. In fact, when he gave me mine, he said to me, now you can put on your toga virilis, which is the Roman word for putting on the toga of a man. Because he thought about these things. He thought Asante was very much like Rome, only a little bit better. But he thought that this was the natural way for a person of his background to dress. And so he went to the office in it, which had not been the custom in the colonial period. You were supposed to wear, shorts and white shirts. And I remember when my first job was at the University of Ghana in the philosophy department, and I went in the first day, like my father, in cloth. Not kente cloth, but a cloth. Mm-hmm. And the people looked at me and they said, you could do that. So this is a room full of people, all of whom wore cloth at home, all of whom wore cloth to funerals or weddings, but it hadn't occurred to them that now that we weren't part of the British Empire, you could dress in respectable Ghanaian clothes. You didn't have to be dressed in a respectable... And I set off a bad train of things, and other people started coming in wearing cloth too. But my father thought that, it wasn't even... And so when he was in governments and so on, most people had an official picture which had them with a tie and a suit. My father always had himself in a cloth. He thought it was a natural expression of who he was. Not a man who had anything against anybody else's being what they were. After all, he married an English woman. But that's how he felt comfortable. And I must say, when I was, once I learned how to wear a cloth, which is a little bit complicated keeping it on, that's why you can't wear it as a child. I did find it more comfortable in the Ghanaian climate than wearing other forms of clothing.
I'm thinking of the expression that apple don't fall far from the tree. A great sense of your father and of you. Now I'm thinking of your mom. She collected gold weights, but she also collected proverbs.
Yes.
And with you, wrote a very, very intriguing treatise on those proverbs.
Yeah,
what was that like to work with your mom to do such a book and to give it to us in Twi?
Yes.
And then with English translations?
Well, so my mother was she was an English woman, but she, insofar as she was a folklorist, she was an Asante folklorist. She was a folklorist of her husband's culture and traditions, and so she did. And in that respect, she was an artist. She'd been to art school as a painter. And when she came, and she was, as a child, everybody in the family, had little collections of something. So when she arrived in Ghana, she started looking around to see what there was to collect, and she fell in love with these small brass weights, which were used in the past for weighing gold, and they come in three kinds actually. Some are direct castings of things like ground nuts and insects and buds and flowers and so on. Then there are two kinds made with lost wax, some of which are abstracts, often with a sign on them that belongs to a system of signs called a dinkra, which is also to be found on cloth, and then figurative ones. And the figurative ones characteristically evoke a proverb. So if you see somebody sitting on the ground with a damaged leg and a pile of stones, you know that it's the proverb about just because he's crippled doesn't mean you can insult him. He'll throw the stones at you. He may not be able to get up and chase you, but he can throw you with his stones. So there are all these proverbs. So she loved these things. Both, they have a wonderful feel in the hand. They look interesting. They're wonderful to research because as you learn about them, you learn, for example, that what they weigh depends on their age, because different weighting systems were used at different points in the history, because the main trade was north to the Arab world at one point, to the Muslim world, and then in that time it's based on the Miktal, the older Islamic weighting system, and then later on it moves into the Portuguese and the Dutch and the British weighting systems. But you also learn to read the signs on the surfaces. So in the course of acquiring a large collection of these things over many years, handling many of them, and basically the way she got to handle them was to let all the traders know that she would buy them, and then she would pick the one she liked and pass the rest on back to traders or to other people or to visitors who wanted them. In the course of doing that, she collected the proverbs. She started writing down the proverbs because they came with the figurative weights. And eventually, by the time I was sort of grown up, she had thousands of weights, but she also had thousands of proverbs, and she wanted to. And they're a very important. This is the spirit of the Brothers Grimm. They express something about Asante, And so we worked, she collected them. She worked with a couple of Ghanaian folklorists who were not academics, not professionals, but people who knew a lot. She went into villages and talked to people and collected for the first time significant numbers of proverbs that men hadn't found because they were proverbs that women used with one another, many of them about things that women like to talk to each other about but don't like to talk to men about. And so there were lots of them, and then if we were going to make them available, we wanted to make them available not just in Tree but in translation. You can't really publish literal translations of proverbs because they don't make a lot of sense. So we published them with the Tree, with a literal translation, and then with a gloss, which is a way in which proverb scholars have developed for presenting proverbs. It took a very long time to translate them all. They're extremely hard to translate. You can imagine, how would you translate, the hurrier I go, the behinder I get, which I believe is a good Alabama proverb. How would you translate that into French? It's hard, actually. So it gets hard to... So it took a long time, a lot of work, and a lot of people. But eventually we were able to publish it. And I think that a lot of people can speak, not just people from Asante, but people who speak Tree, which is the language in Asante, but also other parts of the Akan world in Ghana. It's a kind of, they feel about it, I think, a little bit the way people felt about the Grimm's fairy tales in Germany, that it's an expression of our culture and civilization. It happens to have been put together by an English woman. But she put it together because she loved it and understood the relationship between the proverbs and the rest of life. Because the other thing my mother did was to publish some of the first modern collections of Akan folk tales, including Anansi stories. And the Anansi stories, these folk tales of Asante, characteristically end with a formula, which itself is a proverb, and so many of the proverbs you can only understand if you know the story that they're essentially the last line of, as is true of Aesop's fables. The last line of Aesop's fables often is a similar thing. So anyway, she got interested in all that, and she spent the last part of her life, from the age of 30 on, deepening her love and appreciation of those things, and so we grew up very much around, I would say that was the main form of art that we grew up around. We had some paintings in the house, and we went to painting shows and so on. My mother bought some paintings, but she really loved those.
I would love to get your language that we could use at the National Museum of African Art. As we inevitably say to folk who come to our museum, welcome home. Mm-hmm. And of course, the point that we want to make is that it really doesn't matter which of these identities you wish to claim. If you're just willing to go back far enough, yes, we're going to claim you as an African.
Yes. Well, we are an African species over the long haul. The people who left Africa to seed the rest of the planet didn't just go in that direction. They kept coming back, so there's been back and forth all along. I think one of the difficulties with the metaphor of the tree is that it suggests that you're always sort of, trees do this, right? They spread out. But in fact, of course, in human populations, we're constantly going back. There's constant genetic exchange into Africa from the Arabian Peninsula and into Africa from the Mediterranean world, as well as out. But nevertheless, it's true that not so long ago, certainly not a very long time ago in terms of the history of the planet, a tiny moment ago, and indeed not so long ago in the history of the species, we were all Africans. I think that it's one of the things that's come out of the research on the Middle Passage and what happened to people as they were taken out of Africa in the Atlantic slave trade, is that we've also, I think, come to appreciate that the old picture that they all came from a few places in West Africa is just complete nonsense. of course, in the earliest period, because that's the part nearest to Europe, people came from Senegambia. But in fact, we have now, it's pretty clear that people from all over the continent, some of whom, by the way, of course, had Arab ancestry, as well as other forms of African ancestry, entered the system. So we have both an incredible diversity of origins in the American population, both if you're talking about post-Columbus, post the 15th century, post-slave trade, and of course, if you go back in the long history, yeah, we all start out there. So, and I think that, you know, my mother wasn't an Asante originally, but she had a pretty good Asante funeral. And I remember after my father died, people used to say to her, not people from my hometown, but other people, when are you going home? And she would say, but I am home. I've been home here for 40 years. And finally, she got so mad at these people that she went down to the town hall and she bought a grave plot. And when people asked her when she was going home, she would wave this piece of paper at them and said, "This is where I'm going to be buried. I've already bought my grave." It was next to my father, of course. So, you know, you can claim. She would never have said that she was, I mean, it wouldn't have occurred to her to think of it that way, but you can, she certainly was proud of Akan culture and her relationship to it, deeply interested in it, knowledgeable about it, recognized by people from there as knowledgeable about it, and so on. And so you know, in that spirit, you can go anywhere. But one thing I like to say about the great encyclopedic museums is that they address us in certain moments in our identities. They address me, if I see a gold weight in the British Museum, it addresses me as an Asante. Mm-hmm. But in the same museum, the Ming China addresses me as a human being.
Oh, so well put. Yes.
And so you need to enter museums, and the point is, of course, that the Akan work addresses me as a human being too. It doesn't just address me as an if you couldn't be proud of it as an Asante if what you thought was it's only for us, right?
No, it's good enough for everybody.
It's good enough for everybody, and other people had better show up and show something interesting to establish their bona fides, to claim any relationship to art at all. We know what art is. We put it out there for you, and we want other people to appreciate it. It's not a secret. It's not for us. It's for everybody. That's what it is to value it. Isn't just to value it for yourself. It's to value it for everybody.
Before we open up, I would like to ask this. The preface. Your life has been across boundaries. Mm-hmm. Many of us are very privileged to travel, to interact with folk of the world, to become global citizens in a sense, through our actions. But that's not very possible for many. And yet I've read your suggestion for how every student might begin that process. I read that you often suggest to students every week go to at least one movie with subtitles.
Yes.
Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, this is about the thought that so movies are a great example of a form of art that has national traditions. There's Bollywood, there's Nollywood, there's Hong Kong Kung Fu, and so on. There are national traditions, but if you look at the Kung Fu movies, you can see Hollywood in them. If you look at Hollywood now, you can see influences from elsewhere, and so to understand film, you can't limit yourself to looking at things that only come from one place. And that's true about the arts in general. You know, you can teach a course on the English novel if you want, but you have to remember that the English novel was produced by people who were influenced by their education in Greek and Latin, often, sources. 18th century English writers would mostly, many of them have known French and read French stuff. The sonnet, which entered English verse importantly in the Renaissance, it starts as an Italian form in Petrarch and so on. So even if you want to talk about the literature in a particular place, you have to remember that the artists, the people who made it, were never, you know, artists, was it Picasso who said that artists, ordinary artists borrow but great artists steal? Artists take what they need from wherever they can find it, and they do not notice the passport of the idea when it comes to them. So if you want to make sense of yourself, even if you want to make sense of yourself as an American, you need, through the arts, you need to see American arts as part of a global human dialogue among artwork. So I do urge people, and you don't have to go to Senegal to see Senegalese movies. You don't have to go to Japan to see Japanese movies. You don't have to go to India to see Bollywood movies, or indeed more interesting movies than Bollywood movies, perhaps, that were made in India. And I think that, you know, as I say, to value something in the arts, it may speak to you in your identity, but to value it in the end is to think of it as valuable for anybody, for everybody. And that's what I deeply believe about the arts of the world. And if I think about, you know, as it were, what happens if I get up in the morning and walk out of my bedroom, I walk by a couple of, not very valuable, but still, Chinese ancestor paintings. I walk by an Italian painting. I walk by an Indian painting. I walk by some Hogarth prints and so on. These things come from all over the place. And then downstairs we have lots of African things and Chinese things and so on, things from America in the 19th century, which we live with. And some of them, as I say, speak to me as someone of English ancestry. Some of them speak to me as a person of African ancestry. Some of them speak to me as a Ghanaian ancested person. Some of them speak to me as an American. And many of them speak to me just as a human being.
I told the tale. I said we'd open up. But before we do, just one more. Your book, Cosmopolitanism. Would you share just a little bit about how you came to that concept and why it seems to be so important, not just for you, but for many of us these days?
Well, I think that I can say that I got my cosmopolitanism from my parents, because I take cosmopolitanism to be defined by two thoughts. One is that everybody matters, every human being matters, and the other is, but we're not all the same. Mm-hmm. And people matter even if they're not like me. So that the idea, the slogan is universality plus difference. That's something that I think my parents exemplified when they got married. Neither of my parents could be said to have been people who who ever lost a sense of coming from a particular place. My mother was always an English woman as well as a Ghanaian citizen. She was always someone who had happy memories of a childhood in England, and she was deeply fond of English landscape, which is something that Americans often find rather peculiar. And similarly, my father, who married an English woman and had 4 children, only one of whom lives in Ghana, and he was happy with that, never lost sense of himself as coming out of an Asante family and tradition. So cosmopolitanism is about thinking of yourself as belonging in a species, belonging to the human species, thinking that the fate of every human being matters, and thinking that however we get along, we have to begin by accepting that other people will get along in different ways from the way. We're not going to get along by trying to make everybody the same. That experiment was tried. Europe, for example, tried through the wars of religion to make it a mono-religious region. For several hundred years, we have wars of religion in Europe, and at the end of those after the Reformation, and at the end of that period, what do we have? Well, we have a lot of Catholics and a lot of Protestants, and furthermore, a lot of new kinds of Protestants. Rather than eradicating religious difference, what tended to happen was the people stuck, some people anyway, stuck to what they thought what they wanted to hold on to. So I think people are going to be different. That's fine. And it's interesting. That's why it's interesting to watch movies with subtitles. If everybody made Hollywood movies, movies would be less interesting. I'm not against Hollywood, but I would be against a world in which that was all there was. And so I think at every level, at the political level, at the moral level, at the aesthetic level, thinking of yourself as both belonging in a place or one or two places and everywhere is the right way to think. And you don't have to go everywhere to think like that. I haven't been everywhere. Nobody's been everywhere. You can engage with much of the world without visiting it. And in fact, the wrong kind of visiting can get in the way of cosmopolitanism. You can come to dislike people very quickly if you go into, for an American today, probably parachuting into Kabul for a week and coming out is not the best way to come to love the Afghans. So, travel doesn't guarantee this, but approaching the civilizations of other places with the right attitude enriches you and prepares you for encounters with other people if you have them. And I think that's what we need in the world today. Now, because I'm this sort of pluralist type, I understand that there are people in villages in small towns in Pennsylvania and Amish communities who don't want to turn out to the world. And I believe they have every right not to turn out to the world. I think that they're missing something, but that's their decision, and I don't want to feel that we should force on them a more cosmopolitan view. As long as they treat each other decently, that's fine. But I think that we need a world in which a significant proportion of the population isn't like that, because we do need to solve problems together. We have a shared environment. We have a global economy. We need to think of each other as working together. But I don't think everybody should be forced into it. And if you want to, people in Buddhist monasteries in Bhutan are not interested, apparently, in me, and that's fine. And I'm not going to impose myself upon them.
It's now your turn. As one would say in Spanish, ustedes tienen la palabra.
Yes.
There are microphones, and I think folk are assisting us by moving around with them.
Thank you very much. I was thinking about...
I'm not getting enough volume. Can we have a little more?
Okay. Oh, there it is.
There, so much
Thank
better.
you. I should stand up in all due respect. What I'd like to ask you all, and particularly Professor Appiah, is say in the context of the discussion, the United Nations has declared 2011 the year of the African people of the diaspora. So I would like to know your thoughts about that, say in the context of cosmopolitanism, which is a concept I've always liked, and or internationalism, and also this idea of blended nation. I went to one of the talks, I think, connected to the either this particular exhibit or one before, I can't remember, it's a couple of months ago. So I wish you would comment on that in terms of what you think about I know African diaspora, the term, and there are a lot of lags and gaps there, but, and often people think of it as exclusively political. So, thank you.
Great, that's a good question. So diasporas are, one of the important phenomena in our world, and they're a reflection of the fact that we've been a traveling species all along. We were a traveling species in Africa, and then some spilled out of Africa, and then the human habitation of the planet is a result of the fact that we are a traveling species. And people travel under their own steam, and of course, in the case of the Atlantic slave system, they were forced to travel, and forced migration creates diasporas too. It creates different kinds of diasporas, but it does create diasporas. And the psychological logic of diaspora is to have as one of your identities, never your only one, because you never only have one identity, as one of your identities, an identity that connects you with an ancestral place. That's the sort of fundamental thought of a diasporic identity. It's a fundamental kind of identity, especially in the world today, and it seems to me that it's up to the people who think of themselves as connected with a particular place to make of that connection what they will. It's up to them to figure out what they're going to do with that sense of themselves as connected with a particular place. And they will do different things. I think you're completely right not to insist on the political character of diasporic identities. They're often, in fact, one of the striking things, I think, about Pan-Africanism as a movement in the early part of the century when Dr. Du Bois and Sylvester Williams and so on were engaged in it, is though it was connected with anti-colonial movements, it was also deeply cultural. And if you think about the role of ideas of Africa both in the negritude movement of the French Caribbean and in the Harlem Renaissance, in each of those cases, a sense of an identity rooted in a history elsewhere was central to the life of a cultural movement. So I don't think, at least not in the narrow sense of political, doesn't have to be political. Nowadays, there's a sense of political which we have in the academy in which everything's political. And in that sense, I suppose it's political because it involves issues of power, and everything involves issues of power. But I don't think it needs to be political in the sense of aimed at capturing states or organizing parties or running institutions. And so this form of identity is an extremely interesting one, and reflection upon it can guide us to think about interesting questions, including the whole question of the Constitution in the last 500 years of an Atlantic world. A world in which somebody told me today that, didn't you tell me that George Bush had asked President Lula in Brazil whether there were any black people in Brazil? The answer to that is yes, Mr. President. And that, what's one of the most interesting things about that fact is that Africans arrived in Brazil into slavery as they did in the Caribbean and North America, but the meaning of race in the Brazilian context is just very different from its meaning in other post-slave societies in the Atlantic world. And so a dialogue about the different ways, the different histories of black identity between Brazilians and North Americans, or between Brazilians and Jamaicans and Trinidadians and North Americans, is a very interesting dialogue. And I remember, I've only been to Brazil once. I went when my book In My Father's House was published in a Portuguese translation, and I was taken around by these people from the publishing company, all of whom in the United States would have been white, and they kept telling me how important it was to them that as Brazilians they had African history. So that's not what you have here. I mean, even though, by the way, I don't remember what the numbers are, but a very, very large proportion, maybe 30% or something. Well, let me do it the other way around. I believe it's true that a majority of the descendants of American slaves currently living in the United States identify as white. There's been much more passing than Americans recognize. And there's been so much more passing than Americans recognize that many of these people don't know this fact about themselves, which is why we don't know it. So anyway, so these are different histories, and in diasporas you get interesting conversations because identity, the very same identity terms, Africa, black, get given different meanings, and so actually it can be the source of misunderstanding, but if you approach it in the right spirit, it can be a source of adventure and fun.
I'm going to let you choose.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and to hear both of you. There are two things. I just want to add to why different museums. One would be just a concentration. When you write a thesis, a piece of music, I mean, you have to, you'd be all over the place unless you had a certain theme. So the museums here in this great nation concentrate. There's so much that you can do on women's art. There's so much you can do in Asian art that have not been told. And then the first thing, I've just come from for all the world to see, and I've already seen the last trip, the natural history one, Let's Talk About Race. And of course, this one begins about the negative images of African Americans in this country, and then finally comes to the positive. And so without correcting those images and without giving the right facts that for a long time in this country weren't told, that's why you need these museums. When visiting South Africa, until after apartheid, they would just show the Zulu, you always fighting. They didn't even show the other histories outside of Africa. Now the Natural History Museum shows contemporary, ancient, and North Africa since the 90s when you had Voices of Africa. Before it was the diaspora in the hut and that kind of thing. So I wanted to add that and then add my story also to the conversation. Now, if I tell you my name is Dr. Conchita Ndegi, the Conchita will say, oh, she's Hispanic. Then Ndegi, I know Johnnetta Cole, will say, that's an African name. And to get a little closer to you, I'm a professor of history at North Carolina A&T State University, and I helped to put together the Dudley Building Galleries. And I've been there for 23 years, but I've always had a connection to HBCU. So now my story, I am a product of Xavier University in New Orleans, where I was brought up, and did my graduate work here at Howard. Born here in D.C., my mom migrated during World War II to D.C., met my father, who was from the Philippines. Now you understand the name Conchita, but I'm not Hispanic. The Spanish were in the Philippines. I don't know hardly any Spanish, but unfortunately, he got his law degree and was sick since I was born. So I was brought up by my mother's people, by my grandmother in New Orleans, and always attended HBCUs, from James Weldon Johnson to McDonough 35. I was a majorette, then Xavier. Then I went in the Peace Corps. Lived there for 10 years, married a Ugandan. My only child was born in Uganda. So I tell people my DNA is all over the place, but my culture and politics is New Orleans, African American, and of course, New Orleans in that time and space of the 50s and 60s was partly a New Orleans African American Creole. But I know nothing of the Philippines, and my second Fulbright, I'm asking to go to Indonesia, where our president has some connections. And I would like to visit the Philippines, just to at least to get to know that part. But I know hardly anything. So people, when I visit East Africa, because I've been there, they say, oh no, you're not black. And then when I go, they say, oh, you're half caste or you're colored in South Africa. But blackness is a culture and politics. It's not the outer part of your skin. And where you were brought up and matters a lot to your identity. Thank you.
Thank you. Want to come over this side?
I'm one of the lucky ones. Thank you so much. What a wonderful talk this afternoon. Your response, Dr. Appiah, when you said that, hold on here, I'm forgetting it. The going to Brazil and people insistent on their black heritage and how we won't find that here. It made me think a bit about the Global South and the discourse that is as a collective in response to the history that you outlined for us originally. And I wonder if you could speak to your sense of that collective and the weight of it in the future, perhaps. Thank you.
Well, it's a good question. It's a very large topic. So the South in that sense, the Global South in that sense, is a sort of a political economic, really, a political economy category. It has to do with where you stand in relation to the world's economic system. And I think that we have a long way to go before there's a lot of really successful collaboration on the part of the countries that are sort of peripheral to the global system in arguing for and achieving a greater centrality and equality in the world economic system. But one of the things that I think it's useful to do as part of the general preparation for those sorts of discussions is to make connections that don't have anything to do with economy or politics. It's to have the cultural exchanges that bring Angolans to Brazil and New Zealanders to South Africa and South Africans to India, that allows, not that New Zealand would want to be classified as part of the Global South. Those kinds of sort of cross-national, cross-cultural connections within the South, which are weak because the patterns of movement in the world are shaped by colonial and imperial histories, which mean that it's the easiest way for a Brazilian to get to Senegal is to go through Paris, which involves an awful lot of unnecessary miles. So the sort of the structure of travel in the world is defined by what places are central to the world travel system, and so travel actually within the South is harder than perhaps it should be. But still, the circulation of culture and ideas, Brazilians watching Nigerian movies, Nigerians watching Brazilian movies, and so on. I think that is one of the things that creates the background that means that when you come together in the context of things like the World Trade Organization to try and make arguments for equalizing the terms of trade, for example, you've got more to work with than a mere sense of yourselves as people who have in common that you've been excluded from the systems of power in the world. And one other point, I think it was Forbes that just published its first 50 richest Africans list. Coming from a poor country doesn't make you a poor person.
Here, here.
And living in a rich country doesn't make you a rich person. And so we have to remember that because in the end, as I said, as a cosmopolitan, you think that every human being matters. The fundamental questions about inequality are about the lack of access to resources of particular people. They're not about the lack of access to resources of nations. They're about what the effect is of the maldistribution of resources in the world on the lives of ordinary individual women and men and children. And those things, those forms of inequality are within the South as well as
at an aggregate level, at an average level, between the North and the South. And